Deputy Durkan.
Thank you, Corla, and I want to particularly thank you for allowing me the opportunity to raise this particularly important issue, and to the Minister for coming into the House to reply. In fact, you correctly identified it as the Balyna scheme, Corla, and of course that is an offshoot of the famous Alan Killinagh group water scheme of many years ago, vintage in the 70s, which had many stages and extensions in the interim period. Particularly when the Department of the Environment was itself directly responsible for administering the schemes. Unfortunately, in the last couple of years, there seems to have been a distraction of one sort or another. This affects an area of about 1,000 families, schools, a couple of schools involved, and obviously the local community. I'm not going to go into the usual mode of criticising neglect of rural Ireland. These people are citizens of this country, citizens of County Kildare, and equal treatment with anybody, anywhere, in any part of the country. And suddenly, in the last number of years, there was a well field developed, which for some reason the local authority didn't proceed with, for a number of reasons, I suspect. But to give an idea of how the aquifer in the area is operating, from an artesian borehole, the water was actually flowing out over the top and into a stream nearby for the last number of years. It's amazing, you know, how when this is free water coming out of the ground at this stage, and it should have been possible to harness it. But in the heat of the hunt, what has actually happened is there has been an intervention, and the subscribers have had 80% of their funding refunded. First of all, there was going to be no refund, but now they got 80% of refund. But that's not what they applied for in the first case. They applied for a group water scheme. They applied for the supply of water to their scheme. And it's more than 25 years ago since they first subscribed their money to that particular scheme. Needless to say, I was very disappointed that the scheme was deemed to go no further, particularly since there are a number of households in that catchment area that find they have no drinking water supply. They have a permanently contaminated water supply with what we call rust, which is iron deposit. It is heavily deposited with lime. It is damaging to washing machines and to all kinds of kitchen implements that are used nowadays. And sadly, those people's views and those people's requirements have been neglected. There's no reason for it. Worst of all, in the summer just gone by, one school in the area, the water supply that they had already was deemed to be unsafe, and assistance had to be put in place to enable them to continue. Right now at this stage, I believe, Cancola, and I know that you would agree with me if you were sitting out here where I am now, that there is no reason why that scheme should not be reinvented and resubscribed as necessary, and provided provision made for the men and women and children and families that are living in that area, who are all taxpayers, who are entitled to the same treatment as everybody else. And whoever decided, at whatever level it was decided, that they are not entitled to this treatment, and that there's some reason or some idea of a reason in some quarters that there's a lack of supply or that it can't be done economically, well, you know, it was always thus, Corla. There were always people who couldn't subscribe to a scheme at a particular time. It was left open for them to opt into the scheme at a later time if they wanted to. But in the final analysis, and so far as I am concerned, I have never seen a scheme to be abandoned in that fashion before, and I certainly don't want to see another one, even if I live to be 100.
Thank you, Deputy.
Which I don't intend to do, you'll be glad to know,
Minister,
Chairman.
we are well on the way. Minister.
Thank you, Corla, and I'd like to thank the Deputy for raising this matter with me as a topical issue. Group water schemes are independent, community-owned enterprises and are an important means of providing piped water to rural areas where no such supply exists, as the Deputy knows well. And while I, as Minister, am responsible for overall policy direction and prioritisation in the area of rural water services and for funding for the multi-annual rural water programme, local authorities lead on local implementation of the funding measures. This includes the related administration and requisite capital assessments for inclusion in the funding programme. Group schemes rely on Exchequer funding for infrastructural and maintenance support. The Exchequer also subsidises group water schemes to ensure households do not have to pay for their domestic water supplies. I want to address the specific matter raised by the Deputy, which is the group water scheme that was proposed for development in Balyna in County Kildare. The Balyna scheme commenced planning in its development in the early 1990s. At that time, the scheme proposed to supply over 800 houses, plus farms and commercial premises, to a relatively large area of northwest County Kildare, covering around 4 to 5% of the area of the county. The Balyna scheme was to source its water from a public water supply, well fields at Johnstown Bridge and Robertstown, which was also to be developed and was similarly dependent on exchequer funding. The Balyna scheme, the size of a medium-sized public water supply scheme, would be very large by group water scheme standards. Accordingly, it was included in my department's Water Services Investment Programme for the period 2007 to 2009 for public schemes. And there was little progress on the project over the next few years, and it was not included in my department's subsequent Water Services Investment Programme for the period 2010 to 2013. Since the 1st of January of 2014, Irish Water has statutory responsibility for all aspects of water services planning, delivery and operation at national, regional and local level. Irish Water's primary function is to provide clean, safe drinking water to customers and to treat and return wastewater safely to the environment. Irish Water, as a single national utility, is taking a strategic, nationwide approach to asset planning and investment and meeting customer requirements. I understand that Kildare County Council and Irish Water met with Balyna Group Water Scheme in 2015. It became clear at the meeting that there is a little prospect of the Johnstown Bridge Wellfield scheme, the source of supply for the Balyna scheme, being included in the Irish Water Capital Investment Programme. I understand that alternatives were also considered and discussed at the meeting, but ruled out because they were not technically feasible. Therefore, the scheme would not be able to proceed either in the short or medium term, and the promoters of the scheme were informed accordingly by Irish Water. And I understand that soon after the 2015 meeting, the scheme decided to wind up. Acknowledging that costs were incurred in the development works of the scheme, my department recently agreed to recoup an amount of some €79,000 to assist in meeting these costs, and Kildare County Council was advised of this position on November the 14th of last year. Households in the area of the scheme also have other alternatives to, if necessary, improve their domestic water supply, and the individual wells grant under my department's rural water programme can be accessed through the council to assist with the provision of necessary improvement of an individual water supply to households. And I want to again acknowledge the Deputy's interest in this matter, and I hope that update clarifies the evolution of this scheme in its initial years and what has happened in subsequent years more recent to this. Thank you.
Deputy Durkan.
Thank you, Mr. For the reply, but I have to say that I don't accept or agree with the chronology of events as set out. Needless to say, McCann Corla, simply because I also attended a meeting with the subscribers to the scheme in 2012, 2013, 2014, and there was no indication given at that particular stage that there would have to be a cessation put to the scheme. Nothing whatsoever. And in actual fact, the participants were most anxious that the scheme would proceed at the earliest possible opportunity. And I hate to say that I'm not trying to embarrass the Minister or something like that. The fact of the matter is this, that somebody somewhere made a decision. They're not telling the Minister who made that decision now, but somebody made that decision, and they didn't have the authority of the people of the area in whom who placed a trust in them to provide them with a particular scheme. And the other part of it that I can't remember, that I can't understand, is this: that in fact, long before Irish Water was invented, there was an indication given to the effect that the local authority and the Department of the Environment together didn't want to proceed. And what was simply done was, and I was the person who raised the parliamentary questions, and they're still there to be answered, way back in 2000, from 2000 onwards, asking why provision wasn't made by the department for the provision of capital funding towards the scheme. It was never directly answered. But you and I know, Eoghan Corla, why it didn't happen, because it was spent elsewhere. The money was spent elsewhere. So somebody somewhere decided, and all kinds of excuses have come up since as to why it couldn't and shouldn't proceed. All kinds of excuses were put forward on the basis that, it was really a rural area, they had alternatives. Well, I would ask that somebody would go out to some of the people about whom I just made reference, who don't have a drinking water supply, and who would love to have it, and would love to know what the alternatives are, and who shouldn't be placed in a position where they have to go and spend their own money after all of these years. And I would ask the Minister if he would go down to the people who are directly in the knowledge of all the circumstances of this situation and demand from them that we hear more about what they propose to do.
Thank you, Deputy Minister.
Thank you, Eoghan Corla, and thank you, Deputy, for his reply. I mean, my understanding is that the scheme was originally in proposals for funding, but in the period of time in which it was there to be progressed, it was not progressed, and so didn't make it then into a subsequent programme for funding and for development under that next scheme that followed on from the initial one. Again, this is all before my time, but that is my understanding. I wonder if that's the Deputy's understanding, that it was in an initial funding programme and wasn't progressed in that time and then so fell out of that. My understanding is also that this was understood in 2015 that we were not proceeding with this scheme. The members of the scheme were aware of that, and it was wound down subsequent to that. So I'd be interested to know if the Deputy agrees that that was the case in 2015. Well, we might perhaps then have a chance, Deputy, to discuss this outside of the chamber so we can get clarity between ourselves as to the chronology. What I can say, though, is that since I became Minister with responsibility for water, I have done a lot of work with the National Federation for Group Water Schemes. I've been at their annual conference. I have met with them in a number of different formats to discuss how we can continue to make sure that in every part of the country there is a safe and clean and adequate drinking water supply and wastewater system. And to that end, in April of last year, I established a working group to conduct a review of the wider investment needs relating to the rural water services sector. I had received the group's first report. I received it just before the end of last year, which addresses deliberations on the composition and distribution of funding for the multi-annual rural water programmes from this year to 2021. And I'll be announcing details of that programme, which are basically the priorities for the next 3 years for the funding cycle, shortly. And that will also include details of a revised individual wells grant, which I think will be relevant to people in Balyna, insofar as the fact that we know at the moment that the scheme has not been progressed. Thank you.
Minister, thank you.